Redditors that caught a parent having an affair. What ended up going down? They don't Reddit, but better safe than sorry. I'll try to keep it short. My mother began seeing an old friend of hers, just to hang out, and be friends, and do friend things. But she'd go out all the time with this guy. Sometimes we wouldn't even know where she was, or when she would be back. We being my sister and I, both basically adults at the time also, so we weren't children by any means. Sister gets suspicious and looks through her phone, and lo and behold we find sexual texts and implications of meeting for such activities and so forth. We freak out, get upset, consider telling my father, who at the time was hunting up north and wouldn't be back for a few days. We decide to wait and, as my sister can be pretty rash, then decide to confront our mother. Sister does most of the talking, but mother gets angry at us for going through her phone, then accuses us of trying to ruin her marriage, tells us we are awful basically. It was pretty terrible, and honestly I don't remember most of what was said, but I ended up making a speech about how it's her own fault if her marriage gets ruined, and she tried to say now we don't love her, and what do we want her to do? Move out, go away. We told her to tell father or we would. She doesn't, wouldn't you know it. He tells us not to tell anyone, and gets pissed that we went through her phone. They're still together, and we pretend nothing happened. There's more, but I'm mobiling at work. If you want to know more let me know, and I'll reply on my lunch. I cut school to smoke weed. Mom cut work to blow some dude. I guess he was her boss. Basically I caught them in the act. She did the cliche it's not what it looks like. I don't know mom. I'm not sure how else to interpret his penis in your mouth. It also sucked, because the guy was black. I told my dad. They had a huge fight that got physical, then he left. I have not seen him since. It all started when I was 10. My father has multiple sclerosis and has had it for the last 26 years. He was also a corrections officer and worked the graveyard shift. My dad was the vice president of the Disabled Drummers Association at the time and was tasked with completing a new website. Now my father, to this day, needs help doing most things on a computer. My mother had the idea of asking one of the guys at the local computer store, where we bought our desktop, for some books on building websites, because she was going to attempt to do it herself. This is when a young man, around the age I'm now, 28, offered to help my parents build the website. My mother at the time was about 36, and my father was 42. Chris, the young man, started coming over around 5 to 6 p.m. while both my parents were home, and they would work on the website. This website should have only taken a week or two, tops. It was just supposed to be something simple and informative. Weeks turned into months, and Chris came over later and later as time went on. I started getting a weird feeling about everything. I had a much different perspective of events because the computer was on the bottom floor of our house and I was the only one that lived downstairs. The computer was in our family room, a mere 30 feet from my door. I was 100% certain something was going on about 7 months into this charade when I heard them upstairs watching Saving Private Ryan. I could hear them making out, and to me, I remember it sounding like a sloppy mess, and heard them rounding second and then third base. Needless to say I still have not watched that movie. I heard their conversation slowly progressing as the nights went later and later. To the rest of my family, apparently he had just become a family friend, even coming to my elementary graduation when I was 12. Yes, this affair was going on for years, whether my father was oblivious or chose to believe nothing was happening, as she had cheated once before, a guy named Bob, when I was 6, of which I also knew about, but that story is for another time I suppose. So 2 years later, 3 years later this damn site still isn't done, and he's still coming over, now waiting until after my father goes to work at 9 p.m. One day, in 7th grade, I was 13 at the time, and it was about 1 month before Thanksgiving I finally decided to mention something to someone. I decided to tell my sister, who was 11 at the time, what I knew. She didn't understand, and just kept saying mommy loves daddy. Oddly enough, later that night, my father opened the cell phone bill, which he never did. My mom usually managed the finances. He saw a bunch of calls to a number while everyone was home. My mom had been having undiagnosed bladder issues and had been going to the bathroom constantly. He put 2 and 2 together and it finally clicked in his head. He lost his shit that night. He found out 2 hours before leaving for his 9 PM shift on. Had his uniform on and everything. He leaves at his normal time of 8 PM because he worked about a half hour away and always liked to be early. 9 PM rolls around and I'm still sitting next to my sister and she seems quite confused. My mother sits us down on the couch upstairs and tells us to pack. I tell her I don't want to leave, but she gets angry, starts crying, to guilt me into following her orders. Chris shows up and my mother basically kidnapped my sister and I and we drive to Chris's little apartment in town. It's the middle of the night, so I cannot see street signs. It was a weekend, so I didn't have to go to school for a few days, so we get forced to stay inside a couple days. I still remember the musky smell of his dark upstairs apartment. He had dating books all over his bookshelf as well. I remember hearing them fuck while my sister and I attempted to sleep on the couch. Sunday rolls around and my mom decides to take us to see the first Pokemon movie, as I was a huge Pokemon nerd and it had come out earlier that week. Bad idea, because I learned where we were because I saw the local ice rink, Kennedy Ice Arena. I asked to call my dad because I missed him, and the first thing I did was tell him where I was. At that point my mother offered to take my sister and I home because she didn't want my father knowing the exact location she would continue to stay at. The next week my mom rented her own house in town. I keep saying in town because I lived outside of a city and so you had to drive into town to get anything. Anyways, she rents this house and comes and gets all of her stuff within a week. My sister decides to go with my mom, as my mom was doing a buy or love tactic and I wasn't falling for it. Thanksgiving rolls around a couple weeks later and my father and I make baked chicken breasts with stuffing and mashed potatoes in our empty house. By this time it was more populated with our pets, 3 cats and a dog, than it was with humans. Christmas time rolls around and for the last month it was a string of broken promises from my mother that she would make time for me and promising me she was done with Chris. I finally agree to go spend the night in the spare room at my mother's place and she promises me that Chris won't show up. I agree to go on a night my father didn't work, just in case. Around 11 PM Chris comes. Perfect. There is a phone next to my bed, so I call my dad and ask him to come get me. I'm wearing no shoes, no socks, just shorts and a t-shirt. I walk past Chris and my mother on my way out and wait for my dad. It's quite mild for mid-December, so this blizzard is more slush than snow. I stand at the end of the driveway for 45 minutes, while Chris and my mother are standing all bundled up in the garage yelling at me to come inside, not once making an attempt to even brave the weather to come force me inside. My father finally shows up, and luckily has some blankets in the Astrovan, so I put those on and on the way home I being spewing out the most hateful and cuss-filled rant I have never beat to this day. My parents eventually worked things out, which I believe my dad bit the bullet due to the impending disability the milliseconds would strike, which he is currently in the hospital from a broken hip and new lesions on his spinal cord, which in the end was really the best for him, as my mom does take good care of him when needed now. I have moved on from the situation and put myself into therapy a few years ago to learn how to better control my emotions over the situation, and we have a good relationship now. I have had great suspicions that my mom still cheats on my father to this day, as I have found somewhat circumstantial evidence that I never dig too deep into anymore. As long as she continues to help take care of my best friend and hero, I can deal with anything she decides to do. If anyone decides to read that whole thing, kudos. If anyone would ever like to talk or ask about the situation because they are going through something similar, I'm here to help. No one should go through that alone. Through the whole ordeal I was an emotional disaster, as I was the short fat nerdy kid that nobody liked. All I had was my father. I attempted suicide, as did my father during the whole ordeal, but after we realized we truly had each other we got through it together. Our bond to this day is still unshakable. I'm off to the hospital to see him now. Goodbye Reddit. I was sitting in the back seat of the car while my dad ran into the store for something, and my mom was sitting in front of me. I looked over her shoulder at her phone, not expecting to see anything interesting, but to my surprise she was texting another man about how in love they were. I acted like I didn't see it until I worked up the nerve to confront her about it a week or so later. Once she knew that I knew, she told my father. She didn't want to end the affair, but also didn't want a divorce. My dad and I told her it was us or him, and she should leave if she wanted to be with him. She left that night, but came back the next day saying she chose us. We all knew she kept seeing him secretly, but my dad said he'd rather have part of her love than none. I hated her for a while, but we started to make up and become okay with each other about a year later. About a month after we actually became close again, she unexpectedly passed away. I wasted the last year of my mother's life hating her over that guy, and I will never regret anything as much as I regret that. Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Also, sorry for my bad English. I found out one day I was looking for condoms in my parents' bedroom. I was young and couldn't afford my own. When I found a letter my mother has written to my dad. We all live together, but my mother has always been more comfortable addressing issues written than oral. Please do not make puns of this. I knew I shouldn't read this, but something in me couldn't put this letter down. The letter basically said something along the lines of I can't handle anymore that you have mistresses. I tried to have my own affairs on my own, but I couldn't really enjoy it. I called in Satrandom Guinama here today to tell him we were over, and now I'd like you to do the same with the other girls. Please think of our children. We need to talk about this. I was in shock. I put the letter back where it was and went back to my bedroom. My now ex GF asked me what was wrong, and I told her everything I just read. We talked about it for hours. Everything suddenly made sense. My father was always out of town since I was a kid and left my mother and I alone almost every evening. I saw him several times go on vacations with female friends for entire weekends. Hell, even weeks sometime. Some of his female friends even had dinner at our home, with my mother, me and my brother being here. I don't know how my mother managed to handle this for years. After talking with my GF, I decided to never talk about this to anyone else. The day after this one, my GF and I both went to my house and found my parents on the couch talking and stopping as soon as they saw us. My father had tears in his eyes and my mother was looking at her feet. We acted like normal and left them alone. The situation began to change a little after that. My parents looked more happy and my father was a lot more present in our everyday life. A few months later, my parents announced during dinner to my brother and I that they wanted to divorce. My brother, younger than me, was shocked and had several issues about this for months, cause he was just becoming an angry teenager, but I knew what was going on, and that was tearing me apart. My parents decided my brother and I would stay in our house, and they would take turn to live with us. They each found a cheap flat to live in when they weren't with us. That uncomfortable situation went on for a few months, until we began to see both of my parents home at the same time. At first the official reason was cause our house was more convenient for my father to go to work on a specific day, but my mother then began to stay longer at our home cause she was too tired to go back to her flat. And in a few weeks, the familial situation was pretty much back to normal. Everyone was living 24/7 in the same house until they announced us they didn't want to divorce anymore. This was a few years ago, and now I think everything is forgotten and forgiven. My father changed his job and is now at home almost every evening, and my mother started to smile again. His girlfriend contacted me on Facebook. What a fucking Looney Tune job she was. Apparently he had cut it off with her, and she was desperately trying to figure out why. So, yeah, sure, message me on Facebook. Turns out my mom knew, and was happy to have a confirmation that he had ended it when I told her how insane she was. Good dad. Poor husband. Woohoo, throw away because damn. Buckle up everyone, this one is wild. I was like 18 at the time I think. Let's see if I can keep it short. Dad runs an auto repair shop, so a lot of the time he drives customers home when their cars break down and he has to fix them. For the record, he's fucking shit at fixing cars. One day while I was out with him, I found a cigarette, but in the car that wasn't his. Dad said it was from an old lady customer. I wasn't so sure. Turns out it wasn't, of course. He was having an affair with a drug addict prostitute that he found sleeping in one of the cars on his lot. Mom and I found out the truth at the same time when he left a note on the kitchen table on my mom's birthday telling her he was leaving. It gets even better from there. Mom had a complete mental breakdown and spent months alternating between begging him to come back and screaming at him. She went down to the business daily to try and stop it. I had to call the cops a few times when Dad beat her up for it. This went on until one of the girlfriend's druggy friends smashed her car windshield with a rock and she finally stopped going down there. While all this was going on, I had to deal with strangers calling my cell threatening me if I didn't leave the girlfriend alone. Because Dad was a fucking moron and gave her my number, which meant her druggy friends got a hold of it. Life was shitty and it fucked me up pretty good. I should probably see a shrink for it, but money, no insurance, etc etc. All in all, it lasted a couple years. I wish I had inspirational ending to tell you where we lived happily ever after and Dad withered away, but alas it isn't so. Dad pissed away the family savings on drugs and booze. Then the girlfriend left him and he came back home. He's an alcoholic and we are not on good terms. I still live at home for a myriad of reasons. Health problems, money problems, the resulting mental problems from this nightmare, and the fact that if I leave Mom alone here I worry Dad will accidentally kill her one day while he's drunk. She also depends on me for emotional stability. I fear she'll spiral back into her self-destructive depression if I'm not here. One day I'd like to move out of state to the area all my best friends are at, but I have no means to at the moment. It's gonna take another year or two of saving/working probably. Ranting about it to total strangers on the internet is oddly cathartic though.